Chapter 1, Rude Awakening 2. The Power of Harmony. Yong-ho used it harmoniously. It smoothly connected forces that had been somewhat disorderly connected until now. What was really affected was the power of the dungeon spirits, in particular, a space that could accept the dungeon spirits. Each domain of the dungeon spirits in it was in harmony with each other. The gap was filled, and the space they occupied was reduced. The area that had been expanded when Stravadi, the loser of the eastern area, was defeated, had more space now. Now he could say that was enough. If he exerted the power of harmony once again, he would be able to get it easily. Yong-ho opened his eyes. He couldn't tell how much time passed. It seemed like a few hours or only a few seconds. Yong-ho turned. Instead of looking at the dungeon spirits, he raised his hand. Then he held the magic spear of the red lotus in his hand. Aemon. Yes, my master. He didn't need to ask or reply anymore. He ordered Aemon to be his familiar spirit. Aemon accepted his will. One of Mammon's 12 spirits, Aemon, finally accepted a new master. And Aemon's change began. A bright red flame arose from the magic spear of the red lotus. 5 horns sprout on Yong-ho's head. He released mana, roaring wildly. Even the dungeon spirits experienced a marked change that they had never felt before. They felt a flood of enormous mana. Amon, the magic spear of the red lotus. The leader of the 12 spirits of the house of Mammon, Yong-ho, reached the extreme limit at once, and he finally jumped over it. A new 6 horns sprouted on his head. Aemon's flames did not stop. The flames of the red lotus soon turned into green flames, which filled the room and surged through the dungeon spirits. Catalina and Kaiwan's mana grew dramatically. A 5th horn sprouted on the heads of Eligos, Ophelia, and Tigrius, and a magnificent dragon's power arose from Skull's body Yuho, and Yuan smiled in the green flames. Looking at Yong-ho's back, Yuho and Yuan recalled Mammon, the king of greed, whom they trusted and followed. Finally, you, the king of greed, have come back. Yuho and Yuan turned into light, then disappeared. And at that moment, an enormous mana sprang from Yong-ho again. The King of Fury looked at the letter she wrote in person. One side of the desk was full of letters that she stopped writing and crumpled. Good. This looks just right. It was good for her to push Kitimuka out of her room, who was making a fuss over her letter. In the letter, she politely proposed to have friendly exchanges. He might be embarrassed if I ask him for a meeting suddenly. The King of Fury herself would also be embarrassed in that case. Nodding in satisfaction, she sealed the letter. Then she called Kitimuka, who was earnestly waiting outside the door. Yuria handed out food to the dungeon meerkats. She was depressed because her new friend Lucia moved to a distant place, but she tried to avoid looking depressed. After all, she had Baduk nearby, and dungeon meerkats acting cute to her like this. She rather felt sorry for Lucia, who moved to a remote place where she didn't have any friends. Noticing she was in a bad mood, the dungeon meerkats acted more cute than usual. She burst into laughter loudly as the baby meerkats climbed over her neck and tickled her. Eventually, she forgot to give them food and began to play with them, rolling over the floor. Suddenly, the adult meerkats raised themselves upright. Not just 1 or 2, but almost all of them did. The baby meerkats who were playing on her body also straightened and stared at the sky. Bark, bark. Baduk also pointed to the sky in confusion. Yuria quickly raised herself and looked up at the sky, holding the baby meerkats in her arms. Something was flying through the sky from afar. A huge beast with the head of a bird, a beast and a demon. They were the king of gluttonous forces. The king of violence has never left his dragon rare. It was the last message left by Tamkuruku, the king's 8th familiar spirit, about 3 hours ago. The king of gluttony recognized Tamkuruku's demise, because about all his communication line with Tamkuruku was cut off about 10 minutes after he received the message. He was the king's loyal minion man who directly infiltrated the king of violence's innermost hideout place and obtained the precious intelligence about the king's whereabouts. Even though he knew it was a mission that actually cost his life, Tamkuruku left without complaining at all, and he finally completed the mission. While mourning Tamkuruku's death, the king of gluttony cursed the king of violence that caused the situation as it was now. The death of familiar spirits was a big blow both physically and mentally to the master. However, it meant something different to the king of gluttony. Each of the 7 deadly sins had various characteristics of its own. Just like greed allowed the king to have more familiar spirits than ordinary demon kings, the gluttony possessed by the king of gluttony could digest whatever came in his mouth. The same was true of his increased abilities with the addition of more spirits. Assuming that the relative value of the lost mana was 100 when the general master lost his familiar spirits, the king of gluttony lost only 20 to 30 mana, which was much less than that. As one of many abilities the king of gluttony had. That was why he could consume or change his familiar spirits more drastically than other kings. Nonetheless, Tamkuruku was still his spirit. The king couldn't help but feel so sad about his loss. The king of gluttony pondered over the king of violence. The king of violence was currently staying at his own dragon rear. The dragon corps under his command were on standby at the borders. The king of fury was only caring about the north and the east, as if to imply that he was aligned with the king of violence in one way or another. There was a war still going on in the north. Now is the chance. The king of gluttony made the decision. He no longer thought of dragging on pointlessly. There were abundant harvests in the southern area. It was time to harvest the ripe fruits. The king of gluttony thought of 10 warriors among his elite force, consisting of 8 familiar spirits and 2 general spirits. Each of them was strong enough to be called a single-man corps. Embryo was a competent guy who could be ranked at least in the middle out of the 10 warriors. Of course, Embryo had never revealed his genuine abilities. Granted, his power reached the highest when he died, nobody thought he could be ranked more than the upper middle. In fact, even his upper middle rank among 10 warriors showed he had a mighty power. There were not many with 5 horns ranked in the upper middle status in the vast demon world. The king of the unclaimed land in the south defeated Embryo with such tremendous power. Since he also absorbed the essence of Sravati, the loser of the eastern area, it was no exaggeration to say that he could be ranked in the top group of 10 warriors. After he was done calculating the gains and losses of his war, the king of gluttony fidgeted with his fingers, then summoned the 10 warriors. Summoner Sabnak, the leader of the 10 warriors, faithfully fulfilled the command of his master. As a wizard from the alien world who crash-landed in the demon world hundreds of years ago, he was reborn as a demon by choosing to be a mummy lich with powerful mana. He was the strongest and the longest living among the familiar spirits that the king of gluttony had taken until now. Although he became a mummy, he still had a hooked nose, his pride. Wearing a priest's suit adorned with gold and standing with a cane shaped like a snake, he stared at the ground. 7 of the 10 were placed on the back of Chwiryong, a beast with the heads of a bird, a beast, and a demon. It was only Sabnak's own calculation, but given the average of their combined power, it was comparable to 6 embryos gathered in one place. Moreover, among the 7 was not only the summoner himself, but also the elder lich, Frost. It meant that he could summon hundreds of spirits anytime, anywhere. Given the size of their power, the 10 warriors were too large to be sent to occupy a dungeon. However, their master, the king of gluttony, was not satisfied. He was thorough in his plan, as always. Bifrost had a scroll with which they could install the door of space leap. Due to the nature of the dungeon, which naturally blocked the flow of mana from the outside, it would take several minutes or more to create a proper space door, but that was not a problem. The king of gluttony ordered them to install the door of space immediately when they felt that it was beyond their power. In that case, he said he would help them out directly. The king's order was always absolute. Moreover, it was his gravest order in recent years. To be honest, Sabnak was nervous. Since he always highly valued Embryo, Sabnak was warier of the master of the House of Mammon. However, that was the situation when they started moving into the south. While they left their master's land and flew to the borders of the south, they changed their mind. It was never easy to use magical power to catch a summoner moving at super speed, or to hinder his flying itself. It was natural that the typical master could not defend himself. However, their opponent was the king of the unclaimed land in the south. It was disappointing that they didn't have any means to detect their flying at super speed, let alone any magic field that could stop their flying at super speed. They saw the dungeon meerkats hurriedly struggling to run away on the ground. Some were staring at them, while others hurriedly went into hiding. This meant that the southern people only recognized their invasion through the most basic dungeon defense system. Chapter 192. Rude Awakening. 3. They saw a weird monster in the shape of a dog head carrying a girl on its shoulder and jumping into the dungeon in a hurry. But they didn't care much. Anyway, the dungeon would be smashed away today. Chwiryong landed on the ground. The dungeon meerkats alerted the House of Mammon immediately. Chwiryong, the garrison commander in charge of the dungeon defense, ordered the Black Orc squadron to arm themselves immediately. The orcs, who were on a contingency standby, grabbed their weapons and ran toward their defense position. Assistant Butler Jun ran into the hallway to command the evacuation of non-combat dungeon spirits. John, Ron, and John, the remaining 3 of the Goblin Rangers, escorted Jun. It happened less than a minute after the alarm went off. The moment when the Chwiryong landed in front of the dungeon of the House of Mammon, a new voice echoed in the minds of the Mammon family spirits. As of now, all the members of the House of Mammon enter a special defense posture. All dungeon spirits, please follow the direction. Tilesi. Let me remind you of the message again. As of now, all the members of the House of Mammon enter a special defensive posture. It was Lucius' order. Most dungeon spirits only had fragmentary information about their special defense posture. However, garrison leader Chwiryong and assistant butler June were different. There was clearly a sense of strong tension on their faces. Special defensive posture meant virtually abandoning most of the defense facilities on the first floor. They could not defend the enemy, only with the forces on the first floor, and there was virtually nothing they could do except to buy their time. A special defensive posture was triggered only in such circumstances. Chwiryong immediately corrected his order given to the Black Orc squadron. He ordered not only the troops who had already departed for their defensive positions, but also the orcs who were in a defensive posture to retreat. Their gathering place after withdrawing was not the first floor, but the final gathering place located on the first floor of the Labyrinth of Greed. June tried to overcome his fear. Chwiryong clenched his fists, getting intensely tense. The current master of the House of Mammon was the owner of the southern land. There was no enemy within the southern area that could make the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon so nervous and tense like this. It meant that the enemies who appeared now were from outside, and there was only one among the outside attackers that could mount a sudden attack against the south. Chwiryong gnashed his teeth. He got the ominous delusion out of his mind. He hit the ground only to follow his master's order. Coming inside the dungeon hurriedly, with Uriah on its back, Baduk was aghast at the loudly ringing alarms. Moreover, a girl's constant voice confused Baduk even more. What the heck is a special defense posture? Obviously, Baduk heard something like it before but couldn't recall it well. Back then, Baduk only remembered the taste of the chicken it had shared with Uriah. The seasoning was so delicious. However, Uriah was a little different. When entering the dungeon first, she lost her mind like Baduk because of the big fuss over the alarm, but she got more nervous because of the baby dungeon meerkat that she held in her arms. The girl's voice ringing in her head made a difference. Uriah blinked, but she wasn't sure she was right, so she frowned. Right at that moment, she heard a voice once again, as if to quench her curiosity. Uriah, can you hear me? Uriah was now convinced. Forgetting the fear of the 3-headed beast, Uriah shouted at Lucia happily, startled by Uriah's sudden movement. Baduk barely managed to keep balance. A baby dungeon meerkat stood tall on the head of Baduk and looked everywhere. Lucia shouted repeatedly, "Just run ahead. Go straight, and then downstairs along the ramp you're seeing. You know, Sister Skafak's garden, right?" Yeah, Uriah nodded vigorously. After calming down Baduk that was struggling impatiently, she pointed her finger in the direction Lucia gave her. Baduk, who immediately read her mind, responded, "Bark, bark, run, all right, run." Uriah beckoned to Baduk again. Once it became clear what it had to do, Baduk was not confused anymore. Then Baduk began to run at a tremendous speed, as if to show off its evolution achievements. Several minutes later, when Uriah and Baduk just entered the ramp, the door of the House of Mammon opened. The 10 warriors stepped into the dungeon. Sabnak raised his head. He stared at the ceiling light still shining even though the enemy stormed into the dungeon. The lighting wasn't just turned on at the entrance room. It continued along the corridor. Sabnak could understand somehow that their defense against the enemy penetrating through the air was poor, but he could not help but express doubts about the fact that they didn't block the lights, the most basic of the dungeon defense readiness. It wasn't something he could simply ignore as the lack of their basic defensive posture. He couldn't persuade himself that the man who managed the dungeon of the master so poorly had defeated Embryo. If so, this kind of shabby defense must have been deliberately put in place. Is this a trap? The lighting that continued through the dark corridor was also a signboard, such as, "Come this way," or "Follow our guidance." Some of the 10 warriors were impatient, while others were prudent. Elder Lich Bifrost, who was on the prudent side, showed his intentions with his red eyes. What he meant was that they needed to summon the troops from now on, even if they consumed some mana. Sabnak agreed. Lich, in the shape of a mummy, summoned 3 groups of demons by using the 3 rings on his fingers as a medium. Each of them was a demon trained in attacking dungeons. Only hellhounds were useful for finding the way and tracking down enemies. Demon Joy, a spirit-type giant, was useful for destroying traps. The cannibal ghost, Bugbear, had strong magic resistance and regeneration power. Since each group led at least 10 members, they filled the corridor in no time. Bifrost, who watched them quietly, took out the bone meals from his pocket and sprinkled them on the floor. Skeleton warriors were summoned from each bone piece. As a result, dozens of skeleton warriors were put together immediately. Since they were summoned through bone fragments, they were disposable objects that would disappear when their time limit ran out. But Bifrost could consume them without feeling any burden. After confirming the powerful bone golems standing up among the skeleton warriors, Sabnak advanced the troops again, headed by Hellhound. The straight passage continued longer than expected. There were only a few corners, but there weren't even threadbare traps or scouts along the way. Since their defense posture was so poor, Sabnak rather felt tense and nervous this time. Moreover, the lighting above his head continued to get on his nerves. Hellhound, who he installed as the scout, barked loudly and made him turn to it. Sabnak noticed a forked passage. One was a side road, and the other was a downward ramp. As if to tempt them, the lighting was only on the ramp side. The 10 warriors exchanged their gazes with each other. Then, they looked at their leader for direction. Sabnak nodded. As a matter of fact, he was getting so impatient right now. Sabnak released his power, hoping that all these deceptions by the House of Mammon were not just its masters bluffing. 5 horns strong enough to be equal to almost 6 horns. Following Sabnak, the other 6 also released their mana in succession. Even the weakest had 5 horns. Indeed, they were too powerful to be sent to occupy just one dungeon. It took some time for the summoners to regain their composure, amazed by the menacing posture of the 10 warriors who showed their strength in succession. Hellhounds, who recovered quickly as they were the farthest from the dungeon spirits, took the lead this time and headed for the ramp. Then the undead army that Bifrost summoned followed them. How long had it been since they started going down the ramp? When they went down the ramp only a couple of minutes, something unusual occurred. Instead of the blurry lights pouring from the black ceiling, a bright, brilliant sunlight rained down on them. That wasn't all. A fresh wind blew over them. There was a rich breadbasket in front of them. Well-ripened golden rice plants were swaying in the wind like waves. On one hand, the fragrant scent of fruits was carried along with the wind. It was a beautiful and heartwarming scene. But the only thing that the army of the King of Gluttony led by Sabnak could feel now, as they felt totally out of place and bizarre. Hellhounds hesitantly stepped into the rice fields. Like a necromancer, Bifrost, who deeply pressed the pitch-black robe over his eyes, summoned the skeleton warriors in succession, as if he was anxious. The skeleton warriors he summoned already numbered over 300. No matter how disposable they were, summoning them required consuming lots of mana materials, but Bifrost kept feeling that they were not enough for an unknown reason. Even though the troops led by Sabnak were close to 400, they didn't feel the vast rice paddies were not crowded at all. It was such a vast area. Sabnak had seen numerous dungeons as the King of Gluttonous right-hand man, but it was his first time seeing this kind of dungeon. He couldn't even imagine that he could see the sky and the sun, let alone feeling the fresh breeze inside the dungeon. But the troops of the House of Mammon didn't yet appear. Sabnak prepared a new summoning technique. Bifrost moved the door scroll of space with his left hand so that he could use it at any time. Chapter 123. Rude Awakening 4. At that very moment, when one of Hellhounds at the forefront reached the lakeside in the middle of the garden, there came out the energy of life from everywhere. It was such an enormous power of life that Sabnak and Bifrost, the undead monsters that belonged to death, almost lost their mind momentarily. When they came to their senses, the scenery was changed. A little. A beautiful woman was standing in the middle of the empty lake. With blue aquatic hair, she greeted them with a bright smile. "Welcome to the garden of the King of Greed." She just greeted them shortly, but it was enough to confuse them. The 10 warriors were the King of Gluttony's right-hand men, so they were aware of the potential abilities that the King of the Southern Unclaimed Land might have. The woman with blue watercolored hair was radiating the enormous power of life. She mentioned the King of Greed a moment ago. At the moment, there was something that came to their mind. Pitch black Demon Siemens, one of them, screamed, "She is Skathak, the immortal witch. She is also one of Mammon's 12 spirits." That was nonsense. All the 12 spirits were dead with Mammon. It's already been over 1,000 years since they disappeared along with Mammon and the labyrinth of greed into the dustbin of history. But Sabnak could not immediately deny Siemens. Although he wanted to shout at him to shut up, he didn't. Rather, he found himself agreeing with Siemens. Feeling eerie, he looked back at the woman. The woman with blue hair was still smiling. However, the meaning of her smile was different from before. "It's rude for you to call a lady's name recklessly like that, you small fry." She fidgeted with her hand. The Garden of Life obeyed its gardener's order. Dozens of giant trees that sprang up at once blocked the ramp located behind the 10 warriors. Sabnak cut his fingers in order to perform his best summoning skills. Bifrost lifted the scroll to open the door of space. The rest of them also prepared for the fight. Their response was perfect. But the House of Mammon's forces didn't sit idle. A violet darkness arose through the energy of life in the garden. It was death. The nasty smell of death was spreading like poison. But something strange happened. Life and death, diametrically opposed to each other, did not cancel each other. Rather, they began to care for each other. An unimaginable miracle distracted Sabnak and Bifrost even for a moment. In the middle of their gaze stood a skeleton knight, like an incarnation of death. Riding on a pitch-black beast, he released the power of death. Like a dragon peer, it made even the skeleton warriors, who were already in the realm of death, tremble with fear. One after another, death lined up. Hundreds of skeleton corps suddenly appeared and besieged the forces of the King of Gluttony. Then they rushed toward the king's forces, as if not to give them any time to counterattack. It was a scene reminiscent of the waves breaking down the sandcastle. Despite the fact that they were the same skeleton army, Bifrost's undead army could not withstand their attack at all. It was not a fight, but a one-sided massacre. As if he was struggling desperately, Sabnak barely activated his summoning skills. A huge dark red monster was summoned above his head. It was an 8-legged spider monster, Ongoliant. Bifrost, who came to his senses thanks to the brief lack of mana created by the appearance of the beast, hurriedly tore the scroll. Then he concentrated his consciousness again, because the flow of mana interfering with the magic of the door of space was stronger than expected. One of Mammon's 12 spirits, Skathak, appeared. The skeleton knight and the undead army that sprinkled the energy of death were unusually strong and courageous. However, 7 out of the 10 warriors were gathered here. Each of them had more than 5 horns. So, Bifrost thought he could concentrate hard enough, even for a few minutes, to complete the door of space. But it was his mistake. The moment he tried to start concentrating again, he had to raise his head. He turned his eyes automatically at the storm of strong mana that occurred not far away, as if it was exploding. Each of them was powerful enough to match the 10 warriors. It wasn't just Mammon's 12 spirits alone. That was why they were shocked all the more. A red beast and a wild animal. 2 red demons comprising a male and female pair. 2 dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon, who were known well even before they fought Embryo. A dark elf lady knight with pure white hair, who was an escort knight for the defense of the master of the Mammon family from the very beginning. Normally, she was supposed to be the weakest spirit of them. Tigrius Randolt, a shabby master in the southern area, and the resistance commander of the House of Mammon. Except for the unknown woman with grey hair, everyone was already familiar with the 10 warriors, and their strength was already clearly quantified and recorded in the King of Gluttonous intelligence diary. But, as if to make fun of it, they released a tremendous mana. The 10 warriors could not believe it. It was incredible. This was impossible. No matter how strong the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon became along with their master, it was unreasonable for them to grow this fast. In this case, there was only one possibility. They must have hidden their mana. The House of Mammon deceived the whole demon world thoroughly. Bifrost, concentrate, Sabnak shouted. The 10 warriors rolled their eyes and stared at the dungeon spirits of the Mammon House, who began to rush toward them fiercely. Bifrost considered Sabnak's point right. It was not the time for them to be in awe. So it was urgent to open the door of space so their master could join them. Surely the growth of the House of Mammon was amazing. However, they were the 10 warriors. Even if Mammon's dungeon spirits were strong, they were no match. Moreover, Sabnak was on their side. So the 10 warriors felt relieved. As long as Bifrost himself completed the door of space, the current situation would soon be reversed. But it was their misjudgment again this time. The battle had already begun. It was an urgent situation in which the undead army that Bifrost himself summoned, and those summoned by Sabnak, were being slaughtered helplessly. Nevertheless, they had to pay particular attention to someone from the House of Mammon, the man standing next to the woman with blue hair, the man to whom the immortal witch Skathak, one of Mammon's 12 spirits, bowed politely. He reached out into the air, then grabbed the spear of flames burning with the flames of the Red Lotus, the Demon King of Flames. That was the nickname of the master of the House of Mammon until now. Now they knew who he was. If they were shocked to confirm the existence of Skathak, this time their shock was rather close to despair. Ammon, the spear of the Red Lotus. How could Ammon burn heaven and earth and evaporate the sea with one swing? Ammon was the leader of Mammon's 12 spirits. If this man controlled Ammon, there was only one thing they could think of. As to confirm Bifrost's bleak inference, a massive whirlpool of mana was raging. My master. Ammon's low voice echoed throughout the Garden of Life. Without even thinking about completing the door of space, Bifrost let down his hands. His master, the King of Gluttony, completely missed one fact. The one in front of him was not simply a rookie born with the power of greed. He was already a complete man and a new king who had inherited the previous master's status. Skathak was right. There was only one word to describe the man in front of him. Bifrost sighed out one word: King of Greed. The battle continued. The waves of the green flames covered the Garden of Life. The King of Gluttony, who was standing at the entrance to the fortress-type dungeon on the border and watching the army of the King of Violence, turned. Hiding his impatience, he stepped forward while pretending to be calm as much as possible. Apsaras, bound by shackles and unable to leave the king, trembled with fear. Fortunately for them, the King of Gluttony didn't express raging anger like he did at the last auction house. Instead of killing and eating them, he ordered them to go back. Apsaras hurried back, grateful for their sheer luck this time. However, some of them already feared that the current situation might lead to their greater misfortune. Left alone in the heart of the dungeon, the King of Gluttony held his breath. Again, he let out a long breath and concentrated his consciousness. He repeatedly confirmed the incredible fact through the heart of the dungeon. All of your connections with your subordinate spirits have been cut off. He tried to reach out to them several times, but failed repeatedly. The King of Gluttony closed his eyes. Then he clutched his heart that seemed to be vacant instantly. He howled like a beast. Chapter 1 Team 4, Bold Decision 1. The traces of fierce battle disappeared one by one. It was as if they turned time back. The burnt wheat fields swayed with the waves of golden wheat again. The cracked and huge terrain was restored, and the wind-smelling blood regained its clearness. The water in the lake was the same. It was as clear and blue as before without any redness. It was the giant trees that completely blocked the ramp that had been destroyed, but not restored. These were broken, and even what was left behind disappeared into the ground again. This process was also natural, considering the aspect of returning the Garden of Life to its original condition. The Garden of Life had been completely restored, even its atmosphere, let alone its appearance. The wind was cool under the blue sky surrounding the artificial sun. However, it was only the Garden of Life itself that returned to its original condition before the fierce battle. Smashed members of the Skull unit littered the Garden of Life here and there. All the undead core of Bifrost, which the Skull unit first confronted, fell and became nutrients of the Garden of Life, but it was clear that the Skull unit members also incurred considerable damage, especially the undead that could not be healed with the power of life was fatal. Because of this, there were quite a few skulls that perished forever during the battle this time. It was the king of gluttonous subordinate spirits and the terrifying monster Ongoliant that damaged the Skull unit, whose combat power was well known in the demon world. Young-ho, who sprawled to the ground, caught his breath several times. He was bothered by the body of the dead Ongoliant that lay on the ground as if staring at him. He could not afford to clean it up. It was literally a fierce battle. The king of gluttonous subordinate spirits were never weak. It was certainly true that Young-ho himself and the subordinate spirits of the House of Mammon continued to grow rapidly. Their mana was almost equal to that of the 10 warriors, who Sabnak preferred to call like that. However, there was a clear difference between their years of experience. In martial arts, it was very important how to manipulate one's body perfectly. What did it take to master that control? First of all, it was important to know one's own body properly. For example, one needed to know how long one's arms were or how strong one was physically. The same was true of mana. It was only the so-called geniuses who had complete control over the sudden increase in their power. I think I'm a genius in some way, murmuring to himself jokingly. Young-ho raised his upper body. Fortunately, there were a lot with good combat sense among the subordinate spirits of the Mammon family. Most of the time, they would make good use of their power that grew rapidly. The 10 warriors were all killed. On the other hand, none of the subordinate spirits of the House of Mammon were dead or seriously injured. Even though the battle was fierce, it wasn't Young-ho's own power that brought about this outstanding victory. The Garden of Life. It was the place that Young-ho had been pondering over since he was first warned by Embryo about the King of Gluttony. Where would he fight if he were attacked by the forces of the King of Gluttony? The only place he could think of was the Garden of Life. Since then, he has secured several more floors of the Labyrinth of Greed, but he stuck with his original plan. It was not just the Garden of Life that Skathak's power of life restored. Skathak healed the subordinate spirits in real time who were injured in the battle. She's got the indefinite power to heal. It must have been a hellish battleground from the standpoint of the 10 warriors. Their enemies were recovered from their wounds and weakened physical strength in real time. Moreover, it was not just one or two of them, but everyone. Young-ho, who had fought Embryo with super regeneration power, knew well how much it could stress out the opponents. Although the Garden of Life's rate of recovering the wounded was not as speedy as Embryo, who had super speed regeneration power, the 10 warriors must have been more than shocked. After catching his breath once again, Young-ho stood up, making a sound that looked like groaning or grunting. When he stood up, he now saw what he had not seen before because of his eye level. While everyone was exhausted, Skull, who survived in one piece, ordered its surviving members to gather the bodies of the 10 warriors in one place. Several skeleton warriors were seen carrying Opelia and Aligos, who were half-fainted, to Skathak's mansion, Skullcull. Skull laughed, as if it was telling Young-ho not to worry about the post-battle cleanup. Even though Skull received little help from Skathak because of its undead attributes, Skull ended the battle with the 10 warriors without any major injuries. Maybe Skull was a real combat genius. Dragon bones are really good. Skull! Skull laughed when Young-ho cracked a joke, then refocused on managing its unit members. Young-ho stood in front of the corpses of the 10 warriors collected by the skulls. To be honest, there was not much to eat. When it came to absorbing essence, it was usually inefficient for Young-ho to take it, unless the opponent was equal to or stronger than him. The average strength of the 10 warriors was about 5 horns. In fact, it was a tremendous power, but it was still weaker than Young-ho himself. Moreover, the subordinate spirits like them were big after they died. Their essence has weakened. It was common for the subordinate spirits to be disconnected from their master the moment they died. Their disconnection was not only fatal to their master, rather, it was more fatal to their master in most cases. At the moment they died, the 10 warriors lost the power of the King of Gluttony. Their essence would still have been helpful to the old Young-ho, but as he was reborn as the King of Greed, as the owner of Amon, it didn't help him much. Moreover, half of them are undead anyway. As many as 7 of them were undead. At this point, he was wondering if the king of gluttony was an undead lover, but he thought it was plausible if the king of gluttony was rational and thoughtful. He did it intentionally. Essences with the attributes of death were generally difficult to absorb. Reckless absorption more often brought harm than benefits. It was evident that the king of gluttony considered the scenario where his subordinate spirits were defeated by the enemy. Yong-ho felt the king was determined not to do anything that was beneficial to the enemy. But Yong-ho was not one of the typical masters in the demon world. He was the king of greed. He was greedy, and he didn't waste anything. He laid his hand on. When he opened his hands, he got greedy. He extracted the essence from the bodies of 6 of the 10 warriors. The pile of light that emerged with different colors began to get entangled and rotated, and soon they became one large ball of light and got sucked into his palms. His whole body shook for an instant, but only once. He clenched his fist hard, then completely swallowed their essence completely. His possessiveness, which could be called the true nature of greed, made even their essence with the attributes of death his own. He put together their essences to make them bigger and more valuable. He then took a deep breath. He felt that his mana grew more than before. Considering that the growth of one's mana was very difficult, starting with the 6th horn, he achieved a lot by taking their essence. Is it because of the 10 warriors rather than their essence? The targets of his absorption had lots of things in their essence, including their experience, but he didn't think about it anymore. He looked aside and watched the body of Bifrost, a lich in the shape of a skeleton that gives me a headache. As soon as he saw Bifrost first, he thought it would be a good idea to make him the target of the combination evolution for Skull. However, he ran into several problems when he tried to implement it. The first problem was that Bifrost's ego was strong. Until now, Yong-ho had carefully selected the spirits for the material of synthetic evolution in order to preserve Skull's ego whenever he evolved him. So he chose only those that had no ego. Even if they had very little ego, he attempted Skull's synthetic evolution only after he removed their remaining ego with the help of Aphelios mana. Chapter 195, Bold Decision. 2. However, Bifrost was different from the materials of synthetic evolution Yong-ho had used up to now. He was a powerful lich, so he had a proper self-consciousness. Moreover, in order to inflict enough damage to the king of food addiction, Yong-ho had to kill all of the 10 warriors, for the master was weakened when his subordinate spirits were killed. Yong-ho was not sure, but, probably, the king of gluttony suffered a significant loss from this battle. But there was a problem here. In fact, Yong-ho had never done a synthetic evolution with a dead spirit. He once again looked down at Bifrost's body. It was funny to use the expression dead for this undead who had already died, but Bifrost died anyway. Because of this, Yong-ho didn't have to worry about his first headache, namely Bifrost's strong ego. It was gone forever. Yong-ho also thought that the king of gluttony must have been weakened as a result of the defeat, which naturally addressed his concern about it. Shall I try it? As Yong-ho's mana became stronger, his power of evolution also became stronger. As things stood now, he felt he could bring about synthetic evolution by using the materials of the dead spirits. It's possible, my master, Amon, who had been silent until now, suddenly spoke out. Somehow he spoke in an emotional tone. Amon was smiling happily, perhaps because he used his power properly after a long time, or he had some other reason. Amon continued, although you can use it just once for each spirit, you can have synthetic evolution of the dead spirits and magic equipment with the power of evolution. Yong-ho blinked his eyes blankly. Although he was surprised at the new potential of the synthetic evolution that Amon mentioned, he had some other reason when he blinked. No way. That's true, my master. The great king of greed, Mammon, also had the power of evolution. It was something Amon had never told him before. However, Yong-ho did not regret it. Rather, he noticed the fact that Amon finally started revealing about Mammon. Yong-ho recalled what Amon told him recently. Amon said he was almost fully qualified to hear the truth about Mammon. You don't have to be too impatient, master. 4. Sextang point. Although you might have hoped for it, the king of gluttony might probably be in extreme confusion by now because he didn't know anything about the situation of the battle when his subordinate spirits were all killed. The king of gluttony won't be able to find out if his spirits were killed in action or if they were squeezed to death, and that kind of uncertainty will certainly grow into a monster in his head. Its existence itself will suppress him. I recommend you take a good rest right now. Your injuries are minor, but you have used mana enough to be equal to 6 horns. I think you need stability right now. The skull will also wait until you recover. Skull. Skull as if on cue. Skull shouted, then carried Bifrost's body on his shoulder, roaring with laughter. Yongho nodded. He turned without regret and headed to Skathak's mansion. Bark, bark, wall, wall, awesome. Terrific. As soon as Yongho entered Skathak's mansion, he received a hero's welcome. Baduk was very excited. A little dungeon meerkat was mewing on its back, and Yuria was the most excited among them. Watching Yuria and Baduk shaking their hands and feet violently, turning red in excitement, and the little strange but cute baby meerkat, he raised his head. Then he asked a blue-haired beauty who was sprawling in a chair, exhausted. Have you shown them all your fighting skills? Hey, did you expect me to help you when I was struggling to fight them with all my might? You're so mean, my little master. Even Mammon didn't do this to me. Skathach spoke in a whiny tone, shedding crocodile tears. As she liked to play a prank on him, he didn't think her weird now, but she didn't seem to pretend illness. Actually, her arms and legs were trembling while she was talking to him. The woman that appeared on the lake was actually a replica of her that she created with magic. The real Skathach, sitting on her chair even before the battle began, was absorbed into pouring out the power of life on the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon. Until now, suddenly feeling sorry for her, he just licked his lips, at a loss about what to say. Right at that moment, Yuria flapped her arms and legs again and raised her voice. Cool, cool, you're awesome. I was impressed by this one in particular. When Yongho turned his eyes at her, Yuria took a deep breath. After taking a few steps back, she pointed in the air with an air of conceit and shouted, "I'm the king of greed, wol wol meowing, meowing." Baduk and the nameless baby dungeon meerkat shouted as if to respond. Uriah made a serious expression, but she was cute, but her imitation made him embarrassed momentarily. When did he shout like that? You really said that? As always, Ammon's correction weighed on his conscience. When Yuria was about to tease him again, Kaiwan, who suddenly appeared, hugged his right arm and said, "You're awesome. It's really cool." Then Catalina also appeared right after her and hugged his left arm, chiming in, "I also think so." Actually, both of them were the least injured in this battle. Yongho alternately looked at Kaiwan and Catalina, then turned his eyes at Skathach, who was still sprawling on the sofa, exhausted, on both sides of her chair. Ophelia, Eligos, and Tigrius were asleep, with their heads sticking out of the blue water that helped heal their wounds. Yongho slightly moved his arms held by Kaiwan and Catalina and turned toward Kaiwan. Kaiwan, can you please take Yuria upstairs? When you go there, check the status of other dungeon spirits too. When he pointed at her, Kaiwan moved her eyebrows once and smiled. Stretching out her hand, he grabbed Catalina's arm. "Catalina, go with me." Taken aback by his sudden suggestion, Catalina quickly looked at him as if to see his help. Although Catalina struggled to get out of her domineering attitude in the name of her superior status, she could not. That's why I asked Kaiwan, because I knew she would do it like this. Go together. Send my regards to Rickham, too. He must be concerned about me. Kaiwan giggled at that while Catalina let her ears and tail droop helplessly. When Yuria and her companions, Kaiwan and Catalina, who were making a big fuss over his victory in excitement, went out, Skathach's mansion became quiet again. Yongho approached her, and she fidgeted with her difficult middle finger with an effort and made a new blue water spring from the floor. "Take a good rest, young master. I'm going to hit the sack after making the bed for you." Yongho gently dismantled the silver dragon armor and put himself in the blue water. Skathach said again, "You are not yet my official master yet. You are just my young master. Do you still remember your promise to me? Don't worry. If you're talking about Gusion, let me bring him here sooner or later." "Okay, I'll look forward to it," Skathach corrected the way she sat. Yongho said lastly before he closed his eyes, "Well, I want to thank you for what you have done today. You are welcome. Anytime you like it, just give me an order." He felt good about her cheerful response, so he closed his eyes pleasantly. And how many minutes passed? After watching him sleep for a minute, she smiled before she knew it and whispered, "Have a good night, master. What did you say?" At that moment, Yong-ho opened his eyes slightly. Looking at her face, it seemed that she was pretending not to have noticed his question. When she was caught by him unexpectedly, Skathak rested her chin on her hand. Then, she said slyly like Gusian used to do, "You're my master." Time passed fairly to everyone, everywhere. That was the same when Yong-ho and his party at the House of Mammon began to take a break after their battle with the 10 warriors. There was something passing the sky over the southern area very rapidly. With red hair and wings, it was the fastest among the Garura clan. It was none other than Gardamundi, the faithful friend and servant of the King of Fury Kurtimukas. Comment about Gardamundi was always concise. She is frivolous, promiscuous, and too cocky. Although it was far from favorable, Gardamundi was not dissatisfied with Kurtimuka's comment, for what she said was true. However, it was also true that Gardamundi was both an excellent scout and a messenger. She was one of the only 4 subordinate spirits of the King of Fury, and was the one that could fly fastest and farthest among the Garura clan. Chapter 196, Bold Decision 3. Just as Kurtimuka accurately assessed Gardamundi's personality, she also properly evaluated her abilities. Therefore, whenever she met Gardamundi, she did not make any radical arguments, such as relieving her of her position or removing her from the list of the king's subordinate spirits. Even though she complained a lot about her behavior, maybe she might just be soft. Recalling Kurtimuka's face all of a sudden, Gardamundi giggled, flying in the air. As always, Gardamundi was flying alone. It was such a long distance from the palace of the King of Fury to Encatropagnum, the farthest tip of the place where the House of Mammon was located, but it was no problem for Gardamundi at all, who had the wings of a rock. It was just a few hours of flying distance to her. What happened? Just like the one flying in the sky proudly, Gardamundi also possessed a very good vision. The dungeon meerkats of the House of Mammon, uncharacteristically making a great fuss, was reflected in her discerning green eyes. Did anybody arrive back home? Gardamundi narrowed his eyes to check if there were any signs of outsiders' intrusion. There was definitely nobody who could dare attack the House of Mammon that unified the whole unclaimed land in the south. But there was nothing like an absolute exception in everything. Although Gardamundi had extraordinary discernment, she could notice nothing except for the traces of a large creature's landing. Instead of landing right away, Gardamundi hovered in the air and agonized a bit. Since her own visit would be the first exchange between the King of Fury and the Master of the House of Mammon, she had to be careful. Dang it, I don't know. Let me land anyway. It looks like the dungeon meerkat seemed to have seen me anyway. Kurtimuka's observation of her was once again verified. Gardamundi, scratching the back of her head as if she was annoyed, landed on the ground. Then she opened Sarasvati's pocket and pulled a flag that was dozens of times larger than the pocket. The flag with the coat of arms of the King of Fury, Dhritarashtra, was really huge. The length of the flagpole alone was over 5 meters long, and the flag mixed with black and green seemed to be large enough to cover lots of people. When combined, the flagpole and flag weighed more than a few hundred kilograms, but Gardamundi put the flag on the ground with one hand as if it was a light stick. After inhaling as much as her chest with the red scale armor went up and down, she shouted in a confident and loud voice, "As the messenger of Her Majesty Dhritarashtra, the King of Fury, I, Gardamundi of the Garura clan, would like to ask to meet the master of the Mammon family." Of course, she didn't get their reply to her request. Instead of shouting again, Gardamundi quietly waited for the Mammon family's response, despite Kurtimuka's comments. Since she was right in front of the dungeon entrance, not only the dungeon meerkats, but also the dungeon souls must have seen her. Especially, she mentioned the name of the King of Fury, not anyone else, so if she waited a little more, they would respond. She expected Gardamundi's expectation wasn't wrong again. Within a few minutes, the entrance door of the dungeon opened. It was 4 men and women with green skin and a group of a dozen wolves that appeared before her. Gardamundi immediately knew that she was familiar with some of the wolves. They looked like the wolves that Embryo used to command. What kind of clan do they belong to anyway? Gardamundi's green eyes now turned to a man and woman with green skin among the wolves, and the only woman at that. The woman, neatly dressed in a white shirt and a black suit, made it difficult for Gardamundi to guess. With her dark, straight hair swaying, she was beautiful. Her ears were pointed as if they were those of a goblin or an orc, and her skin was green, the same as that of the goblin and orc clans. She was not an orc because she had no tusks peculiar to the orc clan. Besides, she was too slim for an orc. She's not a goblin either. Several clans came to her mind, but she could not determine which it was. And it was the same for the other three among them. They were all different from each other except for the fact that their ears were pointed, their skin was green, and they were all humanoid. The one on the wagon's coach box was big enough to be comparable to an orc, and the tall guy standing behind the woman was thin and long like an elf. Again, the person standing next to her was just ordinary, but since he stood between the two, he seemed very weird. Gardamundi stopped thinking further. After storing all their images in her mind like an excellent scout, she moved on. Just as Gardamundi first expected, the woman in a black suit came out on behalf of the group. "This is June, the assistant butler of the House of Mammon. My master said that he accepted your request to see him. Please get on the carriage." A couple of men standing right behind June, the woman in black, opened the carriage door. Even without entering it, Gardamundi easily found out that it was a wagon without a single window. That was the common practice when they accepted an outside guest into a dungeon. "I appreciate your master's considerations," Gardamundi replied with a cool smile, then took down the flag of the King of Fury and put it again in Sarasvati's pocket. While she was doing it, the rest of the group, except for Jun, were impressed by her adroit skills like magic with their mouths open. How naive they are. Gardamundi, smiling again, climbed right onto the carriage. She felt quite cozy inside, but, as expected, it was a stuffy space without any window. Given the wall was also quite thick, it seemed that the carriage was soundproof. After Gardamundi sat down, June, the assistant butler, and the two men standing behind him climbed into the carriage together. "Oh, they're doing better than I thought." Shortly after the carriage started, Gardamundi felt her sense of direction was wrong. The manner that she released naturally also hovered around the wagon but couldn't spread beyond it. It was because of the special magic field emitted by a group of wolves that now belonged to Yongho. The reason why the herd of wolves appeared with the wagon was not because they were dispatched to escort June and the 4 goblin rangers, but because their presence made it impossible for the guest to grasp what was happening outside the wagon like now. The carriage moved slowly to match the walking speed of the wolves. Since the House of Mammon expanded its defense area itself, it would take considerable time to lead Gardamundi to its residential area, which in turn allowed Yongho to ponder over the purpose of her visit. "Why did she come here?" Kaiwan asked, as if she was unhappy about the messenger. Ophelia, who woke up hurriedly, opined, given that she came here alone without leading an envoy, she looked like a secret envoy. In other words, she might have wanted to hide her secret visit here from other kings. Obviously, what she said made sense. What she said made sense. Tigrius also agreed with her. Probably she is here to ask for an alliance with us. The House of Mammon is now the proud hegemon of the southern unclaimed area. Although we haven't yet united all the powers in the south, probably we look like a very attractive candidate for the alliance from the King of Fury's point of view. The King of Fury is a pretty good alliance candidate for our Mammon family because she is currently fighting the King of Gluttony, said Ophelia with a smile. This was a situation that reconfirmed the fact that the enemy of one's enemy was one's ally. But at that moment, Skathak, who was just watching them, raised her hand. "By the way, is there any possibility that this messenger will make any attempt to assassinate our master?" It seemed Skathak was on edge because of the attack by the King of Gluttony, but such a possibility could not be ruled out in reality. But Ophelia said, shaking her head, "I don't think the King of Fury will bother to make such an attempt. Besides, she is different from the King of Gluttony, and," after a brief pause, she concluded with a prideful look, "especially, our current master doesn't have to worry about anything. It was the King of Greed who made the King of Gluttonous. 7 spirits tremble with fear." Although Garora, who identified herself as Gardamundi, seemed to be a woman of unusual abilities, it was just unthinkable for her to do anything harmful to Yongho. Chapter 117. Bold Decision 4. Of course, Ophelia did not say that complacently, because she simply trusted Yongho's unrivaled power. Yongho had Aemon, who could be said to be part of him, and when he was going to see Gardamundi, Catalina and Kaiwan would be accompanying him in the reception room. In other words, Ophelia didn't want to create a situation where Yongho would meet Gardamundi without any preparation. Even if the King of Fury really asks for an alliance with us, there is something for us to think about. In other words, we have to find out what kind of alliance she wants, said Tigrius, who changed the main topic back to the matter of alliance. Looking at the objective indicators alone, the power of the King of Fury is overwhelmingly superior to the House of Mammon, so she might not want an equal alliance, but something like a tributary. It was an assumption that made them frown, but the possibility was still there. It could be found only in a fairy tale, that the stronger country offered an equal alliance to the weaker country. The reality was much more severe and heartless. Tigrius continued. Currently, the House of Mammon has already begun an invisible war with the King of Gluttony. I think it's important to know whether the King of Fury is aware of that. Yong-ho, who closed his eyes for a moment, sorted out his thoughts and asked, "What is the worst situation?" "It is when you become the enemy of the King of Fury," Ophelia replied immediately. Yong-ho nodded and said, "Okay, that's enough. Let me listen to what the messenger has to say first, before going further." Yong-ho stood up from his seat after devising his own response in his mind. Then he asked Eligos, who was about to get up as if he suddenly hit upon something. "By the way, where are you taking me now?" "To the Demon King's room on the first floor," he asked, because it was unreasonable for Eligos to escort the messenger to the first floor of the Labyrinth of Greed, not the House of Mammon. Tigrius replied quickly. "Usually, an outsider like her is led to a place like a reception room, but we don't have such a place here." Tigrius looked back at Eligos as if to double-check with him. Put on the spot at the moment, Eligos hurriedly bowed to Yong-ho and said, "Sorry, I didn't know if we would need a reception room so quickly, because we have enemies around us." "Well, I'm not blaming you now. So, where are you taking me now?" Before answering immediately, Eligos made eye contact with Ophelia, who made an embarrassed expression like him, then awkwardly said, "It's a VIP room at the gambling hall. The 10 warriors, the royal bodyguards of the King of Gluttony, consisted of 8 subordinate spirits and 2 general spirits. Abagor and Amdusias, who was watching the King of Envy's war with the King of Pride while leading their troops from the northern area, hurriedly leapt to a space after being summoned by the King of Gluttony. Since they passed through the facilities that the King of Gluttony had previously installed in his estate, they could actually cross the entire territory of the King of Gluttony in less than an hour. Since they were summoned so urgently, Abagor, the devil with the head of a leopard, and Amdusias, with the head of a pure white unicorn, were quite embarrassed. They were even more perplexed, because they already knew that the 10 warriors, except for them, had already been summoned. When they noticed that the Nafsaras were more scared than usual, they felt that something big enough to anger the king happened. The closer they got to the reception room where the king was waiting for them, the more anxious and worried they became for no reason. However, Abagor and Amdusias were faithful enough to be included in the 10 warriors. Paying more attention to the event that angered the king than the king's anger itself, they hurried to the reception room. "I, Abagor, am honored to see your excellency." "I, Amdusias, am honored to see your excellency." The King of Gluttony was sitting at the end of the spacious room decorated with translucent fabrics, with ceilings, walls, and floors. He was almost naked, as if he just had sex, and there were several half-naked, or naked Apsaras lying all over the room. The King of Gluttony threw one Apsaras on the floor, who was groaning as if she was about to die, and gestured to Abagor and Amdusias, "Come closer." The king's order was absolute, suppressing a sense of uneasiness. Abagor and Amdusias approached the king. The king poured liquor into the cups for the two in person. As soon as they gulped it down, the king said, "Abagor, Amdusias, I'm going to make you my subordinate spirits from now on." He made a bombshell announcement. Abagor and Amdusias couldn't open their mouths in amazement mixed with various meanings. The number of his subordinate spirits was limited. Nonetheless, the king just announced that they would make the two his subordinate spirits. Was there a vacancy now? If so, what happened? Although they had doubts, they were full of joy at the same time. How long have they earnestly coveted this position? Even though they were not his subordinate spirits, they rose to the status of the 10 warriors. It was clear that if they could become his subordinate spirits and directly share the power of the king, they would be able to reach a much higher level than now in terms of power. But the King of Gluttony didn't give Abagor and Amdusias time to think about it. As soon as he was done talking, The king put his big hands on the shoulders of the two to perform the ceremony. It took just 1 minute or so, at most. Abigail and Amdusias felt they were reborn completely anew. They roared in great joy and pleasure, and felt thrilled by the mighty mana that soared inside their body. The king of gluttony's voice was heard again in the ears of the two who were indulged in spiritual ecstasy. The king said calmly, "I haven't given you all yet. There is a little more I can give you. Close your eyes and try to relax. Subdue your mana." Abigail and Amdusias immediately followed the king. They closed their eyes and suppressed their soaring mana. It took almost 10 minutes or more for them to do it, because they were just done reinforcing mana as a result of their transformation into his subordinate spirits. And finally, they managed to subdue all their mana. Abigail and Amdusias became calm and waited for the king's next words. The king of gluttony withdrew his hands from their shoulders, then touched their chests. The king tore the hearts of the two and pulled out their hearts immediately. It happened so quickly. The moment they felt the pain, the king was done already. "Oh, your excellency." Abigail barely managed to open his mouth. Amdusias collapsed, vomiting blood. Instead of looking at the two, the king stared at their beating hearts in his hands. He began to eat them full of essence entirely. Then he activated the power of gluttony. He still felt he was lacking. Although the mana he gained by eating the two after making them his subordinate spirits was greater than that of those who died, the king felt he was still lacking in mana. The loss of his 8 subordinate spirits in succession was so devastating to him. The king of gluttony stretched out his hands. Then he chewed Abigail and Amdusias alive, who were still breathing because of their strong vitality. His newly aroused gluttony strengthened him by drawing every little power from what he had already eaten. The king of gluttony now lost all of the 10 warriors. The king of violence and the king of fury were still healthy and active, and the war in the north would be finished within a few months, no matter how long it would take. It was a precarious situation. After sitting idle and passing time like this, there would unfold a situation in which the king of gluttony himself would be eaten as the weakest king, to his embarrassment. He had to avoid it by all means. So, he made the decision while crushing Amdusias' bones. Although they tended to forget it easily, overwhelmed by the 7 deadly sins, each king had his own power as a demon king. With his current power as the king of gluttony, there was still a possibility for him to turn the tide. So, he had to recover even a little more power if he could. Although he hardly used his power after becoming one of the 6 kings, it didn't mean that his power was weakened or disappeared. He believed that the power that had sustained him from the time he was an insignificant demon would give him a chance to overtake again. Therefore, the king of gluttony did not hesitate. That was why he restored his strength by killing the remaining 2 of the 10 warriors who barely survived until now. He continued to eat his loyal servants. Chapter 1:8 The Flow of Fighting. One of the 5 directors of Dungeon Market had different areas to take care of. It was the strongest power, Orobas, among them, who was in charge of the territory of the King of Pride, north of the demon world. Because of this, if the King of Pride wanted to make a secret deal with the Dungeon Market, just as the King of Gluttony made a secret deal with Samael, the lady with the fastest wing, who was in charge of the east of the demon world, he had to face none other than the manager of the north, Orobas. But the one that the King of Pride was facing now was a completely different person. It was in a large, spacious room, but only 2 were facing each other now. As always, the King of Pride was dressed in white. The one sitting across from him wore colorful robes and boasted of his gorgeous look befitting his robes. His 7 horns, standing tall like his pride, caught the king's eye first. His head shaped like a rooster's with coxcomb, and his 2 legs made of a snake with different poisons also evoked a strange and mysterious feeling. He was one of the 5 directors of the Dungeon Market, namely Abrasax, the strongest mana holder. He was originally in charge of the west side of the demon world. The King of Fury and the King of Violence were supposed to be his clients. "You were doing great. Congratulations." The most important thing in the demon world, which could be called a world where the strong preyed upon the weak, was the strength or weakness of one's mana. At least, Abrasax thought so. Abrasax's nickname, the strongest mana holder, was not a fake or exaggeration. He was truly the strongest mana holder that the Dungeon Market boasted of. There was nobody comparable to him in terms of pure mana among the 5 directors who stood shoulder to shoulder with him. This man with such a tremendous power talked politely to the other man. He never used honorific language when he was dealing with anybody who was weaker than himself. He used honorifics only when dealing with someone who was at least on par with him. The King of Pride was well aware of this. That was why he felt happy when Abrasax greeted him even briefly. The King of Envy is just a hysterical old man. In fact, what really matters is what happens next, the king said. He was talking about what to do after defeating the King of Envy, or to be precise, what would happen right before he defeated the king. Unfortunately, it seems difficult for me to help you openly at this point, sir. Abrasax, who had a rooster-shaped head, had nothing like facial expressions on his face. The only thing that could tell his feelings was his 2 eyes under his 7 horns shaped like a crown. The King of Pride didn't bother to look into his eyes. As before, he responded leisurely, "I don't care, because the dungeon market is like that in the first place. It has been like that since it was first made." He twisted his voice at the end, suggesting he was very displeased at the moment. Not knowing whether he noticed a subtle change in the king's voice, Abrasax asked with a surprised look, "Do you know the beginning of the dungeon market?" "Oops. Sorry about my stupid question. If there is one place in this demon world that is older than this dungeon market, it is the royal family of the King of Pride." The king was not sure if he really made a mistake, or if he deliberately tried to promote the royal family of the King of Pride, but the King of Pride didn't feel better. Just thinking about the start of the dungeon market, or merely recalling the reason why the founder of the dungeon market established it, made him even more displeased. In fact, even the 5 directors of the dungeon market did not know about its founder, let alone why he established the dungeon market. The founder was arrogance itself, and it was just absurd to know that the product of his arrogance had been continuing through thousands of years until this moment. The King of Greed, the man who doesn't exist anymore, who had never shown himself for 1,000 years. Therefore, the title King of Greed was used for only one person in the demon world. It was impossible to think of anyone else. The King of Pride tried to subdue his displeasure. After reading his intentions, Abrasax began to talk about the deal earnestly. A secret deal was struck between one of the 6 kings and one of the 5 directors, and the deal was a little more special than any other secret deal. Its very unusual Gardimundi, who was led by June, the assistant butler, to a rather luxurious room, sat down and looked around. No matter how often she looked at the room, it was far from a typical reception room. When it came to the reception room of a demon king, it was supposed to have a wonderful royal throne, vassals of the king standing on his left and right, and a wonderful red carpet leading from the king's chair. But this room was different. First of all, it was small, and there were a sofa and a table. The sofa resembling a semicircle, as if to hug a shiny table, was soft and comfortable, but very suspicious. She felt like she was in a high-class bar room furthermore. Gardamundi rolled her eyes again. She fixed her eyes at the ventilation at the corner of the wall, made of red and colorful wallpaper. She saw 4 glowing eyes through the lattice-patterned lid of the flat and long ventilation openings. One pair of them belonged to a little girl, and the other pair was those of a baby dungeon meerkat. They didn't seem like a watcher. She felt like they were rather little kids who came out secretly out of curiosity. Is she the master's daughter? Maybe not. Gardamundi looked straight again, feeling rather complicated. Fortunately, she heard the voice of June, the assistant butler, at that moment. Our master has arrived. The very door where Gardamundi entered was opened. Gardamundi once again had doubts about the authenticity of the reception room, but she hastily got it out of her mind. Now it was more important for her to welcome the master of the Mammon family. Gardamundi quickly got up from her seat and turned to the door. When she made eye contact with him naturally, she greeted him politely by putting her hands together. Gardamundi of the Garura clan, the messenger of Her Majesty the King of Fury, is honored to greet the master of the House of Mammon. Niece to meet you. You must be tired from your long journey here. Thanks for coming. Make yourself at home. At the moment, Yongho was torn between using honorific language and talking informally, but he chose the latter to be on the safe side. As if she didn't expect his honorifics, Gardamundi looked slightly surprised but sat down with a smile. Then Yongho sat in a one-person chair across from Gardamundi. Catalina, Kaiwan, and Ophelia, who followed him, stood behind his back. Was the rumor true that he was a womanizer? She once heard rumors that he was accompanied by several women all the time. She felt the rumors might be true. His sexual preference is unique. A dark elf with a sober expression, a sharp-looking beauty with gray hair, and a red demon woman who looks pretty mature. Gardamundi noticed that she was bothered by the gaze of the woman with gray hair in particular. In a situation like this, Gardamundi would have taken issue with it and pick a fight, but she didn't. She was in the House of Mammon, and above all, she came here as the envoy of the King of Fury. After ignoring her sharp gaze, she got up again and presented the gift she had brought. It's Amrita that the King of Fury made herself. She didn't have to explain further because it was obviously a gift of friendship. Ophelia received a golden box containing Amrita gladly on behalf of Yong-ho. It seemed that they were going to have a successful talk. The King of Fury wants to build a good relationship with the Mammon family. I think her message in this letter is better than my voluminous words. She has written it in person. Here was a letter the king wrote herself, in addition to the precious liquor she made in person. Ophelia smiled more happily, unlike Chwiryong, whose facial expressions became a little more ferocious. After handing over the golden box containing Amrita to Catalina, Ophelia walked again to the front and accepted the letter. After checking it out briefly, she gave it to Yong-ho. He took a big breath because the scent leaking out of the letter was really pleasant, as if to confirm the widespread rumors that Gandharva was a clan with a good smell. He even felt his heart was pounding for no reason. He opened the envelope and took out the letter. Her soft, gentle handwriting that befitted her fresh and nice look caught his eyes. It took about a dozen seconds for him to read the letter. While everybody was waiting for his reply in a tense moment, Yong-ho folded the letter and asked Gardamundi, "Can you wait for a moment until I write a reply?" "Sure, please. I'm going to wait gladly." "Then excuse me for a moment." Chapter 199. The Flow of Fighting. 2. He stood up from his seat and left the VIP room of the gambling house slowly. A VIP lounge located not far from the gambling VIP room. Chwiryong shook her head with the dungeon spirits of the House of Mammon gathering there. She said, "This is exactly what I expected." There was something special when they made eye contact with each other that day. Yong-ho wanted to ask about the reason why there was a VIP gambling room and restroom when there was no reception room, but now was not the time for him to dwell on it. After ignoring Chwiryong's reaction, he convened an emergency meeting with his aides. In the letter, the King of Fury expressed her wishes rather directly. In summary, the gist of the letter was as follows. "I want to make friends with the House of Mammon. Shall we start exchanges step by step, starting with small things?" Ophelia said, "It is obvious that she is a kind person, contrary to the rumors that she is a warmonger." This time, Tigrius expressed his opinion. Looking at the letter, she is polite, and she is not making any unequal demands. I'm a bit bothered by the lack of details of her demands, but her proposal to start exchanges sounds very good. Alliance with the King of Fury was what the House of Mammon wanted too. The current situation was different from when Yong-ho had to fight the enemies everywhere in the southern area. He needed more allies now, because he rose to the same position as the 6 kings in the demon world. In fact, he was also quite excited because it was the first time somebody made a proposal for a military alliance to him after he became the master of the House of Mammon. "So," he asked, recalling the King of Fury's face, "do you think it's okay if I just write, 'I welcome the king's proposal'?" Since he received her handwritten letter, it was polite for him to deliver his own letter as well. Ophelia replied, "It would be nice to let the King of Fury know that our war with the King of Gluttony has actually begun." "I think it's too early to tell her now," Tigrius added. "The King of Gluttony lost almost all of his subordinate spirits because of the battle today. Since he suffered such big damage, he won't be able to do anything about the Hoshu of Mammon for some time. We have enough time to build a good friendship with the King of Fury." Yong-ho nodded and said unwittingly, "How fortunate. It looks like the King of Fury will be our ally, not an enemy." Now that Yong-ho started confronting the King of Gluttony, he had to avoid making a new enemy. However, another king, who happened to stand up against the King of Gluttony, reached out to him first. This was a situation where God helped Yong-ho. "By the way, Master, shouldn't we prepare some gift for the King of Fury?" Catalina asked, looking down at the golden box in her arms. Like the letter, the box also smelled extremely fragrant. As if she was right, Ophelia immediately chimed in. Her gift, Amrita, is not an ordinary gift. It is an expensive item, also called the elixir of immortality. Moreover, if Gandharva's chieftain, King of Fury, has made it herself, its value is really tremendous. He was happy to receive a great gift, but the problem was that he had to send an equivalent gift to her. If he sent a gift with much less value than hers, it could negatively affect the King of Fury's good intentions, who proposed starting exchanges. Ophelia said again with a smile. In going to select some of the good stuff from Stravati's collection, from the King of Fury's viewpoint, the House of Mammon is a prestigious family that has just restored their past glory. So if you can only show your sincerity in a gift, it will do. In other words, the King of Fury would not expect any expensive gift commensurate with hers. At that moment, however, Catalina raised her hand somewhat timidly and said, how about sending her some chicken? Along with the gift, Young Ho blinked, not knowing what she was talking about, but other spirits reacted differently. Eligos said first, it's not a bad idea. Chicken is also a special product of our Mammon family. Wait a minute. Special product? When was it established as a special product? Tigrius agreed with Eligos and said, if we use the magic of conservation, it won't take much time to send the chicken to the King of Fury. If you tell her you fried the chicken in person, I think it's a very good gift because it carries your respect for her. Hey, isn't it an open exchange between kings? Asked Ophelia, giggling loudly. Well, it's a secret exchange this time, because the King of Fury doesn't know yet that our master is the King of Greed. It also means our intention that we want to start exchanges step by step as she wanted. So, I also agree with Eli Brothers' opinion. I think it would be nice to include some chicken in the gift. Seeing them agreeing with her opinion, Catalina flapped her ears and tail, feeling proud. Kaiwan tapped Yong Ho, who was confused at the moment. Be proud. Your chicken is the best. Skull, skull, yelled Skull as if to agree. After all, Yong Ho accepted their suggestion and wore an apron to fry chickens. I think he is the best candidate as a groom, Kurtamuka said with a confident expression. Gardamundi, sitting on the other side, shook her head while eating chicken legs in both hands. Gosh, I think you were lured by some delicious food. If not, how come you are trying to entice our king to get married to that guy? Yum yum. Don't you think you're going too far? Kurtamuka wanted to shout to her to eat the chicken in her mouth first before talking, but she narrowed her eyes because she was bothered by something. Looking at the chicken bones piled up in front of Gardamundi, she said, Is it okay for a chicken to eat chicken? It's not chicken, it's chicken powder. I know you like to eat pork, you bitch. Gardamundi snapped sharply, but Kurtamuka laughed it off because she was satisfied with the fact that she made Gardamundi provocative, who was relaxed and composed. Anyway, that's my overall evaluation of him. Not a person lured by delicious food. Having said it seriously, Kurtamuka turned her eyes at the King of Fury. There were 4 colored boxes in front of her, and each of them contained fried chicken that she had never seen before. Kurtamuka raised her finger when the King of Fury picked up what was called soy chicken. First of all, he is not under the control of any king. Tasting the savory soy sauce chicken, the King of Fury shrugged her shoulders slightly. In no time, she looked at the seasoned chicken. Second, he is a man. The seasoned chicken tasted sour. In particular, chicken skin with plenty of seasoning was fantastic. The crispy and oily taste of the skin stimulated her appetite. Third, he is the king of the southern unclaimed land, not anywhere else. Geographically, it's good to make him our ally. When the King of Fury's gaze turned to Padak in the 3rd box, Kurtamuka drew a picture with light in the air. After drawing the entire map of the demon world immediately, she made a lump with a new color. If our secret alliance with the King of Violence works properly, we can confront the North by joining hands with him in the whole southern land. And that's not the only geographic advantage. The King of Fury put some radish among the chicken in her mouth. The radish, cut into just the right size to eat, took away the greasy taste in her mouth. Besides, its crunchy texture was so good. Feeling satisfied, Gardamundi presented something called coke to her Kurtamuka, kept talking alone while the two were absorbed into enjoying the fried chicken and drinking coke. I heard that there are not many people in the southern area, given its vast area. Besides, the population there has decreased because of the current clash there. In other words, the situation in the south was a sharp contrast with that in the land of the King of Fury. The territory ruled by the King of Fury had lots of mountains, so there was not much land for the people to live. Besides, there were many countries sharing borders with it, so there occurred small disputes constantly. As a result, the population density was too high in the inland area where people could live stably. If our talks with the master of the House of Mammon goes very well and build a good relationship with them, we may be able to move some of our people to the south. Although the southern area is a bit barren, people still live there, so it would be nice for our people to live there, she said. Moreover, the southern land was much safer. Chwiryong still had doubts about the King of Violence, but if the King of Violence could really be trusted as an ally, like the King of Fury said, the situation would be completely different from now. Chapter 200. The Flow of Fighting 3. The southern area shared its border with the territories of the three kings, the King of Violence, the King of Fury, and the King of Gluttony. If two of them were the King of Fury's allies, the only king left out was the King of Gluttony. Since there was only one hostile border and the King of Gluttony had to confront the other three, it was only natural that the King of Fury would see a greater stable area than now. The southern area was a land that none of the kings were supposed to occupy. But if somebody joins hands with the king of the southern land quickly, other kings won't dare to do anything. This was in line with what the King of Gluttony had thought of initially, but he differed on the method of using the southern area. The King of Gluttony intended to set up a puppet king and rule the southern area from behind the scenes, but Chwiryong wanted the King of Fury to obtain the whole southern land through a marriage alliance. Fourth, since he is an outsider, he doesn't have any interests in our 8-race people. In other words, there is no chance he can cause any political conflict here. As the name suggests, 8-race people consisted of 8 different clans. They were the Deva, Dragon, Garura, Gandharva, Yaksha, Asura, Kalavinka, Maharaga. With the clans as many as 8 in one country, there were constant quarrels. Their fighting did not escalate because of bigger enemies surrounding them. But there were some clans pitted against each other, such as Dragon versus Garura and Kalavinka versus Maharaga. That was one of the reasons why the King of Fury did not choose her groom until now. If the King of Fury, the head of Gandharva clan, and the king of the 8 clans chose a man from any particular clan as her groom, it was highly likely that her selection itself would disrupt the stable order within the 8 clans. So, she had to choose her groom from the outside, but she could not find the right candidate until now because those who were qualified to be her groom were under the control of another king without any exception. She continued, Fifth, he has a good personality. If he can make a delicious dish as a gift like this, he must be a fine character. Are you listening to me now? Chwiryong narrowed her eyes. The King of Fury, who was enjoying original fried chicken with relish after dipping it in salt, nodded quickly, startled by her question. Of course I am. I was listening, she hurriedly replied. The red seasoning on her left finger belied her reply, but Chwiryong approached her a little closer instead of questioning her further. Then she said in a strong tone, Then, do you agree with me? The King of Fury was about to nod on impulse, while Gardamundi, watching her reaction quietly, clicked her tongue. She struck Chwiryong in the back of the head with a hand full of chicken oil. Hey, Gardamundi, she shouted angrily, which was terrible enough to reveal her nature as a Yaksha woman. However, Gardamundi took it leisurely and gave her a chicken leg. Even the enraged Yaksha woman relented, enchanted again with the fantastic taste of the fried chicken that she just received before she knew it. I know you're pretty much impatient, but don't rush it too much, said Gardamundi. With a grumpy expression, Chwiryong ate the chicken leg. Gardamundi grinned at her, then put her ass close to the King of Fury. She asked in a gentle voice, What do you think of him? Do you like him? I really like it. Especially, I love this seasoned chicken. Good. Blushing a bit after she knew she gave the wrong answer, the King of Fury tried to hide her embarrassment by clearing her throat. After catching her breath once, she said calmly, Since the current situation in the border area is not unusual, we can't stay relaxed forever. I think it is necessary to properly build an alliance with the House of Mammon in the southern area. If we can build a coalition with the King of Violence and the Master of the House of Mammon, we can not only effectively pressure the King of Gluttony, but Also keep the king of the northern area at bay. She didn't yet know the fact that Yong-ho literally had smashed the 10 warriors, who could be called the core of the king of Gluttony's forces. If she had known it, even Kirtimuka would have wanted an alliance with the House of Mammon more. After listening to the King of Fury seriously, Gardamundi nodded as if she expected it. Then she took her face closer to the King of Fury and said, "Then I have a clever scheme." "Clever scheme?" A bit anxious, the King of Fury asked back, pulling her body slightly back. Gardamundi said, getting closer to her more even after the King of Fury stepped back. "Yes, it is. Why don't you propose to meet him? Whether you want an alliance or more than that, you need to meet the master of the Mammon family anyway." The King of Fury could not respond readily. Gardamundi put her face much closer to her and said, "Yes, you meet him." Normally, the King of Fury would have ignored her words, calling her crazy, but for some reason, the king rolled her eyes shyly before nodding quietly. A bright smile was on Kirtimuka's face, and Gardamundi was satisfied. She suddenly stood up and said, "Tomorrow, I will visit the House of Mammon again to convey your message. Please give me your handwritten letter. Oh no, please make a video. Video. Yes, video." The King of Fury blinked, then gulped before she knew it. Chicken and peace. Everyone seems to be happy. Yong-ho and his subordinate spirits were floating in the blue water prepared by Skathak at her mansion. He was rather tired at the chicken party held to celebrate the war victory right after seeing off Gardamundi, but he felt fully satisfied with the results. "I think I have to go back home soon and bring some more ingredients, especially coke." He closed his eyes, thinking of his trip back to the human world. He wanted to have a good and sound sleep right away, but he couldn't, for he had to devise some plan to deal with the new proposal from the King of Fury. "The key is how the King of Gluttony moves forward," said Ophelia, who was in the blue water like Elagos. The 10 warriors he lost this time were not only his subordinate spirits, but also generals who led their own army. Although there are still many powerful demon kings under his command, it's certain that his main force has been weakened considerably. That was what Tigrius had already pointed out. However, the situation now was somewhat different from when he mentioned it first, for an envoy sent by the King of Fury visited the House of Mammon. The King of Gluttony is now engaged in a war of nerves with the forces of the two kings, the King of Violence and the King of Fury, at the borders. It is very likely that the King of Gluttony was trying to hide the fact that his 10-warrior group was annihilated, because the current crisis facing him is a golden chance for the other two kings. Then, would it be better to leak the tips about this to the King of Fury? Yong-ho asked. The fact that the House of Mammon defeated the 10 warriors was significant in various ways. It could reveal the power of the Mammon family to the King of Fury, but at the same time, it had the symbolic meaning in that he gave the King of Fury a gift with sensitive intelligence about the King of Gluttony. Generally, both sides should be roughly equal in power for a strong alliance. In other words, a unilateral alliance with one dependent on the other would not last long. Tigrius, who was silent, answered Yong-ho's question. "I don't think it's a bad idea. The more aggressive the King of Fury becomes, the more difficult it will be for the King of Fu to pay attention to us. In the meantime, we will be able to gain more time." Time. As it was important to everybody, time was especially a valuable resource to the House of Mammon. Being strong in a short time was only possible for a beginner. So, it was common for those who had already reached a certain level to go through ups and downs while growing stronger. However, there was still enough room for growth on the part of the Mammon family. Yong-ho had yet to occupy half the labyrinth of greed, and there were many flaws for him to challenge in the arena. Crucially, Yong-ho had the power of evolution. He could gain more evolution EXP through hard struggles. Having gained considerable EXP during their fight with the 10 warriors, he could use the power of evolution once again if all of his subordinate spirits strived a little more. Effort in the arena. Mammon, the king of greed, also had the power of evolution, and Yong-ho understood why the 12 spirits of Mammon could become so strong. It was because of the power of evolution. That power led their power to the highest level. Come to think of it, even synthetic evolution could combine other items, right? As if he suddenly remembered it, Yong-ho asked, looking at his right arm. Amon answered immediately,